Hi, I'm back, and I changed outfits. Because it's a different day and everything, but because, changing clothes every day is something that you probably should do. It cuts down on the smell and other hygiene issues. Gentlemen, I'll pause and let you write that down. It's a life lesson you might want to know about a little bit more. Okay, as I was saying earlier, B period is a little bit ahead of you guys in third period, which I know, shock, but hey. Uh, you guys, I believe, are back in Roman numeral 2, talking about de jure segregation and de facto segregation, I think. If I'm going over stuff you've already gone over, then just spend a few minutes listening to the mellifluous tones of my voice. Otherwise, hey, let's get started. So, when we last left our heroes, we were talking about the civil rights movement of the 1960s, talking about de facto segregation, de jure segregation. De jure segregation is segregation by law. De jure segregation is segregation by law. De jure segregation is segregation by law. If you haven't noticed by now, I'm going to try to repeat terms 3 times. So that was 3. I'll try. I can't promise it because I get easily distracted, but I'll do what I can. In any case, de jure segregation is the kind that is illegal, or rather unconstitutional. We cannot have de jure segregation. That's what the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments basically say. It's not good. And so, in the case of Brown versus Board of Education, the Supreme Court said de jure segregation is never okay. Separate but equal can never happen because it's never going to be okay. And the South's response basically was, well, why don't you make me? And the Supreme Court was all like, no, you got to do it. And the South was all like, my daddy says it don't. And that's the civil rights movement in a nutshell, really. No. This did prompt lots of course action and so forth. Probably the most famous practitioner in the civil rights movement, Martin Luther King Jr. He has his birthday is a holiday. It's coming up in 2 weeks. He was, again, founder of the Southern Christian Leadership Council. SCLC was his group. Famous for their nonviolent protests. SCLC, again, name of the group, famous for their nonviolent protests. In particular, what they did was known as a sit-in. It was a common tactic during the civil rights movement in which they would go to a place that was segregated and refuse to leave. So they would go to a whites-only restaurant and sit in the whites-only section, and they would refuse to leave, in which case the police would come and arrest them, in which case another group of African-American patrons would come in and refuse to leave. This cycle would continue until eventually the owner would just have to give up, because the logic was you can't just keep arresting people all day, it's going to turn away all your other customers. So by doing this, they were forcing desegregation. Probably Martin Luther King Jr.'s biggest, most famous moment is, of course, the March on Washington. The March on Washington takes place in 1965 and is a massive, massive meeting in Washington, D.C. For desegregation and civil rights in general, highlighted by Martin Luther King Jr.'s famous I Have a Dream speech. Again, probably the high point of the civil rights movement, arguably. Of course, not everyone was in favor of the civil rights movement. There were lots of people who were against it. We would call these people racists or segregationists or just not nice people, whatever term you wish to use. One of the more infamous ones of these, which was a name I probably should have put on your outline but forgot to, is named Eugene Connor, a.k.a. Bull Connor. Eugene Connor, a.k.a. Bull Connor, spelled E-U-G-E-N-E-C-O-N-N-O-R, I believe, and bull being spelled like the animal. Eugene Bull Connor was the sheriff of Birmingham, Alabama, famous for his really, really, really impolite treatment of civil rights protesters. And by impolite, I mean he used fire hoses on them and let loose wild dogs, on protesters, including small children and women and unarmed people, because he said, hey, look, it's a group of peaceful people who are protesting for their rights. That makes me mad. Have a fire hose. Yeah, this was, not that uncommon as on what's unfortunate about it. So, while Bull Connor is, again, probably an extreme psychopath, he's not that far out of the mainstream at the time, which is what's really, really sad. But what was interesting about Bull Connor is that his techniques actually backfired on him. The story goes that President Johnson watched incidents like Bull Connor attacking peaceful protesters, and he became so outraged that he personally pushed through the Civil Rights Act of 1964. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 effectively outlaws de jure segregation nationwide. It prevents you from segregating by race in employment, housing. I'm drawing a blank. Practically everything, though. Employment, housing, service, again, like, restaurants and things like that, government services and so forth. If you accept government money in any way, you cannot segregate. Which began this whole sequence where the government used interstate commerce. We talked about this earlier. The government basically said if you use interstate commerce, you cannot have you cannot segregate at all. So as a result, this is how they forced restaurants to desegregate. They would take interstate buses and stop at restaurants and forced those restaurants then to desegregate. And then, of course, the buses were set on fire and the protesters were beaten. So when I say that this law stopped segregation, I don't mean that it permanently stopped segregation, but it was a step in the right direction, because the thing is, de jure segregation, again, is illegal, but you can't easily stop de facto segregation, which is our next term. De facto segregation is segregation of fact. It's segregation that just happens, that you can't stop necessarily. De facto segregation, again, is segregation of fact, or segregation that just happens. Segregation of fact, or segregation that just happens. That's de facto segregation. You can see because the word fact is in there. Fact, de facto. It's segregation of fact. It happens. It's and again, my hands are just sort of bad hand. All right, where were we? De facto segregation, again, basically means segregation that just happens. It's segregation of fact. What this means is that if you live in a neighborhood that happens to be all white, that's not necessarily illegal, because it just happened to be that way, because human beings like to live near people that we're similar to. We're just, that's the way we are. Hence why, like, Chinatown or Little Italy is not illegal. The thing of it is illegal if you preclude other people from living there. So, like, if your subdivision is all white just because everyone happens to live there and they're white, that's one thing. If the real estate agents won't sell to anybody who isn't white, that's illegal, and that will get you in deep, deep trouble. So, while we ended de jure segregation in the 60s, by the time you get the 70s and 80s, de facto segregation starts popping up more and more. The government did try to stop de facto segregation with things like busing. Busing was a tactic tried in the 1970s in which students, African American students, were put on school buses and sent to all-white schools, and white students were sent to predominantly African American schools. The idea was that they were going to force the students of different races to mix. Busing was an attempt to stop de facto segregation because, of course, in the public schools, you go to your nearest public school. So if your entire neighborhood is white, your school is going to be white. That's just how it is. The flaw in this, of course, again, is that basically made a racially segregated school because schools would be either all black or all white. So busing was supposed to fix that problem. But busing was incredibly unpopular with both groups. African Americans didn't like the fact that their children were being sent to schools 3 hours away. White families didn't necessarily like the fact that their children were being sent to African American schools. And so after lots and 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 lots of complaints, most states gave up on busing. In North Carolina, some areas still use busing, but for the most part, we've given up on it. I think I remember the last time I heard about it was early 2010s. Raleigh was still doing it to a certain extent. But for the most part, we gave up on that. And busing is sort of a larger sign of the government throwing their hands up in the face of de facto segregation, saying, you know what, it's fine. We're not going to be able to solve this. Because remember how we talked about how you can be racist, you just can't do racist things? That's sort of what de facto segregation is talking about. You can't punish people for thinking. You can punish them for their actions. So if they're going to be racist and stop someone or not give them service or not let them buy a house because of their race, that's illegal. But if you just don't want to live near other races because it makes you uncomfortable, the government can't necessarily stop that. And that's what de facto segregation is. On top of that, by the time you hit the 70s and 80s, you also have a burgeoning movement within the African American community of whether or not integration is really worth it. This gets you to black power and black nationalism. Black power was a philosophy, I guess is the word I'm looking for. It was a philosophy that gained traction in the 60s and 70s and 80s that basically argued that in their rush to integrate society, African Americans have lost what makes them special and unique. And that's a bad thing. Again, it's a philosophy big in the 60s, 70s, and 80s that argued that by pursuing integration, African Americans lost what made them special and unique. They essentially were trying too hard to integrate, but rather than mixing with white people, they were just becoming white people. And so this was the Black Panthers, this was the Black Power salute, this was a resurgence of Afrocentric culture. This is, for example, like where Kwanzaa, the holiday, comes from, is largely the Black Power movement, and this whole period of the 70s and 60s and 70s, where the idea was to reinforce African American lifestyle rather than simply copying what white people do. No, Black Panthers oftentimes get sort of a misunderstanding here that this is not, violence against white people. We hate white people. We don't want to be, with white people or anything else. That's not Black Power necessarily. That's Black nationalism. Black nationalism is the more extreme end of Black Power. Black nationalism is the idea that Black culture was superior to white culture, so they should not want integration. Whereas Black Power was just, don't forget who you are. Black nationalism is much more, we don't want to be integrated because we're better than you. That's Malcolm X. That's the much more extreme end of the Black nationalist community. The neo-Black Panthers, I think, kind of fit into that category. They're the ones you see on TV periodically. The neo ones, not the original ones. Again, the idea here was that the African American community should not want to be in the white community because, again, the white community is inferior. In fact, there were many who argued, there was a branch of Malcolm X's theology that basically argued that white people had been created in a lab by an evil black scientist. Again, not everyone believed in that. Black nationalism believed in that, but, that was part of the idea. In addition to the African American community pushing back with these new philosophies, you've also got some pushback from the white community with the idea of affirmative action. Affirmative action was a policy created by many companies, organizations, and so forth that had been racist in the past. The idea of affirmative action is it is a positive step or a proactive step, no, say positive, a proactive step in the present to make up for misdeeds in the past. It is, a proactive step in the present to make up for misdeeds in the past. It is a proactive statement or a proactive action to make up for misdeeds in the past. So, let's say, for example, your university never admitted black people because they were racist. So the idea is that now you guarantee a certain percentage of your group or your student body has to be minority in order to make up for the fact that you never before let minorities in. Or your company never promoted women to managers because women were dumb. And so now we require that a certain percentage of managers be women to make up for the fact that, back in the Stone Age of the 1950s, we all thought women couldn't handle any tasks more complicated than secretarial work. So, again, step in the present to make up for the fact that in the past you messed up badly. Now, some of you might now be asking yourselves, well, isn't that kind of reverse racism? And that was the argument in court. In the 1970s, you have a Supreme Court case, Bakke v. California, which tests whether or not affirmative action is acceptable. Bakke, I want to say his first name is Jim. Somebody can look that up. Bakke was a student who went on to attend the University of California Medical School at Berkeley. However, he was denied entry, whereas an African-American student with worse grades got in. He sued then on the grounds that they wouldn't let him in simply because he was white, and that was racist. The Supreme Court in Bakke v. California basically says yes and no. You cannot give someone a promotion or a job simply because of race, like solely because of race. But you can include race in among many characteristics or many factors. So in this case, because the other student had worse grades, yes, that was racist and therefore unconstitutional. But if it comes down to a tie on all angles, like for example, if two students have the exact same grades, then it is okay to give preference to somebody because of something like race, gender, religion, etc. Because the idea is that the school or the business or whatever has an interest in exposing students to different viewpoints, in diversifying, etc. So it's okay as long as it's not the only reason somebody gets a job, a seat, etc. This was challenged again in the early 2000s with the Michigan cases. The Michigan cases were two Supreme Court cases in the early 2000s. I want to say 2004. Again, someone can look that up if you really, really want to know. In the early 2000s, two Supreme Court cases involving affirmative action, one involving the University of Michigan, one just involving the University of Michigan Law School. Long story short, what the Supreme Court say in the Michigan cases is that you cannot use race as a quantitative factor, meaning it cannot be something like automatic. You cannot give them points for being a race or anything like that. However, if you want to include it as a qualitative measurement, as part of everything else, that's okay. In English, what they're saying in the Michigan cases is you cannot essentially put a point value on being a minority. You can't give somebody 2 bonus points because they're a minority. You can't, give somebody 5 points on an evaluation because they're a woman. But, again, if you look at everything as a whole and you consider their race, that's acceptable. In other words, you don't have to ignore race, but you also can't give preference to race. Now, there is a Supreme Court case currently being discussed that might throw all of this out the window, but that's the current status of affirmative action. It is considered to be constitutional within certain guidelines. As long as, again, you're not giving automatic bonuses or automatic preferences, it is considered to be acceptable. There. That takes care of Roman numeral 2, and you should now be more or less caught up with the other class. And again, if I've spent 10 minutes talking about something you don't remember, or have already talked about, then, again, hopefully this helped clear something up. But on to Unit 3, or Roman numeral 3, not Unit 3. Roman numeral 3 it is, yes. In the next section,